Attention! Prepare yourself for a deep journey into one of the most macabre and disturbing cases in the history of the Appalachians. Before we begin, I ask that you comment below where you are listening from and what time it is for you at this exact moment. In Clay County, Kentucky, there is a dirt road that winds through the hills like an old scar. The road has no official name in county records, but locals have always called it Penitence Road. During the winter of 1957, that road became the setting for events that would remain concealed for decades, hidden behind deliberate silence and municipal documents that simply vanished from the archives. The story, however, begins much earlier. In March of 1942, a man named Reverend Silas Drummond arrived in the tiny village of Redbird Creek, a community so small it did not appear on most state maps. Drummond was not a young man when he arrived. He was approximately 53 years old, with grey hair slicked back and a voice that, according to local Baptist records, could make the floorboards tremble during sermons. He did not come from any major city or known institution. He simply appeared, carrying a single leather suitcase and a Bible so worn its pages seemed ready to fall apart. What few knew at the time was that Drummond had been removed from two previous congregations, one in Tennessee and one in West Virginia. The exact reasons were never formally documented, but preserved ecclesiastical correspondence vaguely mentions issues related to unconventional disciplinary methods and a particularly strict interpretation of the doctrine of penitence. In a letter dated October of 1941, a deacon from the Morgantown Church wrote that Drummond held an extremely literal view regarding the necessity of physical suffering as a prerequisite for spiritual redemption. Redbird Creek was the perfect place for someone who wished to remain unseen. The community consisted of approximately 120 people, most working small subsistence farms or coal mines miles away. The local Baptist church had been without a pastor for almost 2 years after the death of Reverend McAllister, an elderly man who had served the congregation for 4 decades. When Drummond volunteered his services, the church elders accepted without asking many questions. It was wartime, and any man willing to assume spiritual leadership was considered a blessing. During the first years, Drummond behaved in a relatively conventional manner. His sermons were long and intense, focused on sin, guilt, and the constant need for moral vigilance. He visited families regularly, sat at their tables, learned their problems, their debts, their secrets. He had a peculiar ability to make people feel watched even when he was not present. According to testimonies collected years later, many residents began confessing small sins to Drummond, things they had never shared with McAllister. A woman named Ruth Hensley, 38 years old at the time, allegedly admitted in private that she stole small amounts of money from her husband to buy fabric. A man named Jacob Coulter confessed he had lied about the amount of corn he harvested to pay less tithe. Drummond listened with a neutral expression, no visible judgment, but also no absolution. He never said that sins were forgiven. Instead, according to preserved diary entries, he stated that God's forgiveness required more than words. It required proof of genuine repentance. And that proof, he suggested, needed to be physical, tangible, something that demonstrated the person's willingness to endure discomfort in order to purify the soul. In the autumn of 1945, with the end of the war and the return of men from the front, the community's dynamic shifted. Many returned with traumas they could not verbalize, drinking silently, avoiding their wives, locking themselves in barns for hours. Drummond saw an opportunity. During a sermon in November of that year, he began speaking about physical penitence as a necessary path to spiritual restoration. He cited biblical passages on fasting, early Christian self-flagellation, and the idea that the body must be subdued so the soul could ascend. The concept was not entirely foreign. Many people there had been raised with austere religious views in which suffering was a natural part of human existence. But Drummond pushed beyond rhetoric. He began proposing specific practices, small at first, prolonged fasts, kneeling prayers for hours over stones, nighttime barefoot walks along frozen mountain trails. These practices, he claimed, were not punishments, but voluntary offerings to God, acts of devotion, and the community began to accept. Not everyone, but a significant portion. Perhaps because life was already harsh, and a bit more suffering seemed natural. Perhaps because Drummond presented refusal as a kind of spiritual cowardice. According to a diary entry dated January of 1946, written by a woman named Edith Carr, there was a growing sense that those who did not participate were being silently judged. The community gradually divided between those who submitted to Drummond's practices and those who kept their distance. In April of 1947, something changed permanently. A man named Thomas Briley, 31 years old and a carpenter, disappeared for 3 days. When he returned, he was visibly altered, thinner with deep eye circles, limping. According to his wife Mary, he refused to say where he had been, only stating that he had gone through a necessary process. When she insisted, he repeated that he now felt purified. In the weeks that followed, other men, and some women, also disappeared briefly, returning with the same distant expression and silence. What no one outside Drummond's inner circle knew at the time was that he had established what he called penitence retreats. These took place in an isolated mountain cabin about 8 kilometers from Redbird Creek, along the very road later known as Penitence Road. The cabin had belonged to a hermit who had died years earlier and was abandoned when Drummond found it. He discreetly repaired it with help from loyal congregants, transforming it into a site dedicated to what he described as intensive purification. Exact details of what happened during these retreats were never fully clarified, but fragments remain. In a medical report from 1958, a doctor from a neighboring county recorded treating a man from Redbird Creek for injuries consistent with prolonged cold exposure and severe dehydration. The patient, whose name had been redacted, refused to explain the injuries, only stating they were part of a personal commitment to God. In another instance, a visiting nurse noticed unusual marks on a woman's back. When questioned, the woman quickly changed the subject. During the summer of 1949, Mary Briley wrote a letter to a cousin in Lexington, later preserved in a historical archive. She described profound changes in Thomas's behavior: silent, almost apathetic, performing daily tasks mechanically. At night he often woke sweating, murmuring that he was not worthy. She had tried speaking to Drummond, who reassured her only that Thomas was undergoing necessary transformation and that she should be patient. Other wives shared similar concerns, she wrote, though none seemed willing to confront Drummond. In October of that year, a deeply troubling escalation occurred. A 19-year-old named Daniel Foster did not return from a penitence retreat. Drummond told his parents that Daniel had chosen to extend his spiritual reflection and would return when ready. At first, they accepted the explanation, but when a full week passed without news, Daniel's father, Robert Foster, decided to investigate. Robert Foster went to the mountain cabin to look for his son. He found it empty, cold, showing no signs of recent occupation. When he confronted Drummond, the Reverend remained calm, claiming Daniel had likely chosen to undertake solitary reflection elsewhere, perhaps following one of the trails toward Tennessee. Daniel Foster was never seen again. There was no formal investigation. His family eventually accepted the idea that he had simply abandoned the community, something not uncommon for young men from the mountains at that time. But a church record, handwritten by Drummond and dated the 23rd of October of 1949, listed Daniel Foster as having completed his final penitence. The meaning of that phrase was never clarified. The following years were marked by increasingly oppressive silence in Redbird Creek. The community split into two distinct groups, those deeply involved in Drummond's practices and those who kept a cautious distance. There was no open confrontation, only tension. Families stopped visiting one another. Children were told not to play with certain other children. During church meetings, some pews were conspicuously empty. In February of 1953, a woman named Agnes Howell, 42 years old, died under circumstances that raised questions. Officially, the cause was recorded as pneumonia, but the doctor who signed the certificate had not examined the body, relying only on family testimony. Agnes had been known for intense participation in penitence retreats in previous years. Neighbors said she had lost drastic weight in the months preceding her death, spoke little, and spent long hours alone. Her husband, Luther Howell, provided almost no information, saying only that she was at peace when she departed. Drummond conducted the funeral, using the sermon to preach about the beauty of total submission to divine will. He suggested Agnes had reached a rare level of spiritual purity and that her death should not be mourned, but celebrated as a transition to a higher existence. Several people present later reported deep discomfort with his words, though no one voiced objections at the time. During the winter of 1957, the events reached a breaking point. In December, a severe snowstorm isolated Redbird Creek for nearly 2 weeks. The roads became impassable. The community was cut off from the rest of the county. During this period, Drummond called what he named a collective penitence retreat. He declared that all faithful members of the congregation were required to participate in an intensive spiritual journey lasting several days in the mountain cabin. The storm's isolation, he claimed, was a divine sign. Approximately 40 people responded. They departed in small groups over 2 days, walking through deep snow toward the cabin. Among them were men, women, and some older teenagers. Those who remained behind were mostly the elderly, small children, and a few families who'd already distanced themselves from Drummond. In the days that followed, Redbird Creek became eerily silent. Houses belonging to those who had left remained dark. Smoke ceased rising from their chimneys. Some residents expressed concern, but the snowfall made any attempt at search impossible. When the storm finally broke in early January of 1958, a group of men who had not joined the retreat decided to check on the cabin. According to an extremely brief police report, filed on the 9th of January of 1958, they found the cabin in poor condition, with signs of recent occupation, but no people present. There were blankets stacked, remnants of scarce food, and stains on the wooden floor that the report vaguely described as organic in nature. The 40 participants returned to Redbird Creek over the next several days, but never all at once. They arrived in small groups, usually at night, slipping quietly into their homes. Neighbors' questions were met with evasive phrases such as, "I was fulfilling my penitence," or, "It cannot be explained in words." Most disturbing, according to testimony, was the shared expression in their eyes, an emptiness beyond physical exhaustion. 3 people never returned: Hiram Parsons, 51 years old, Louisa Madden, 34 years old, Naomi Sloan, 17 years old. When questioned, Drummond claimed they had chosen individual spiritual paths and would return when ready. Their families, distraught, demanded clearer answers. Drummond then called a special meeting of the congregation. This meeting, held on the 23rd of January of 1958, was when Drummond revealed that the collective retreat had been the apex of a process he had been building for years. He described rituals requiring fasting, prayer, and physical renunciation of earthly attachments. He used vague terms: total detachment, voluntary sacrifice, transcendence of the flesh. As for the three missing individuals, he claimed they had reached a level of purity so absolute that they could not return to ordinary life without compromising their spiritual progress. He suggested they had departed to live as hermits, dedicated entirely to divine contemplation. Some accepted his explanation. Others sat in tense silence. But the families of the missing did not relent. Robert Parsons, brother of Hiram, travelled to the county seat in Manchester to file a missing person report and expressed his suspicions about Drummond. An investigator was dispatched to Redbird Creek in February of 1958. The investigator, Deputy Marshal Edmund Hale, interviewed many residents. His surviving notes reveal an investigation stymied by lack of cooperation. Most interviewees claimed to know nothing unusual. When asked about the disappearances, they repeated Drummond's explanations nearly word for word. Hale visited the mountain cabin and found it meticulously cleaned, no evidence of crime. He questioned Drummond, who remained calm, delivering a coherent narrative about voluntary spiritual practices. Without bodies, willing witnesses, or tangible evidence, Hale closed the investigation in March of 1958, classifying the disappearances as voluntary abandonment. His final report suggested he doubted his own conclusion but lacked any legal basis to continue. He left a marginal note recommending continued monitoring of the community. That monitoring never happened. Authorities shifted focus elsewhere. Redbird Creek slipped back into obscurity. Drummond continued leading his congregation. Official penitence retreats ceased after the winter of 1957, but rumors persisted of secretive, ongoing practices. In June of 1961, Drummond suffered a severe stroke during a sermon. He collapsed at the pulpit and was taken to a hospital in Manchester, where he remained partially paralyzed until his death in August of that same year at 72 years old. His funeral was small. The congregation dissolved soon after. Many families left Redbird Creek. The Baptist church closed in 1963. The mountain cabin deteriorated and collapsed in 1967. Penitence Road eventually became overgrown and nearly impassable. The three missing persons of 1957, Hiram Parsons, Louisa Madden, and Naomi Sloan, were never found. In 1969, a team of historians documenting rural Appalachian churches visited the remains of Redbird Creek. Only a few elderly former residents remained. One of them, Ezra Mullins, 83 years old, agreed to a recorded interview. He spoke cautiously, describing the community as marked by a sadness that never fully dissipated. When questioned about the disappearances, he hesitated, saying that some things had been silently agreed upon and were never to be discussed. He ended the interview abruptly. The tape was archived at a Tennessee university and largely ignored until it resurfaced decades later. Among the rediscovered documents was a letter written in 1964 by Edith Carr, the diarist mentioned earlier. Terminally ill, she wrote to a lawyer in Lexington, attempting to leave testimony. In the letter, she described participating in the collective retreat of 1957. She wrote that Drummond told participants they needed to offer something of value, equal to the weight of their sins. He spoke of Old Testament sacrifices, the purifying power of pain, the need to prove devotion through extreme acts. She described days of absolute fasting, non-stop prayer, and severe cold exposure. Some participants began hallucinating, speaking in tongues, seeing visions. Drummond encouraged these states. As for the three who disappeared, Edith said Drummond had chosen them as supreme examples of devotion. She did not detail what happened, only that they were taken to a separate section of the cabin and the others were told not to interfere. She heard noises during the night, but was too delirious to process them. By morning the three were gone. Drummond then made everyone swear an oath of silence, stating that breaking it would betray God and those who had sacrificed so much. Edith ended her letter expressing lifelong remorse for remaining silent. She died in October of 1964. Her letter never led to further investigation. Redbird Creek was slowly erased, physically, culturally, and historically. The forest reclaimed its land, the church vanished, Penitence Road faded into the wilderness. The few descendants who remain rarely speak about it. In 1966, hikers found a severely deteriorated Bible near the region. Inside, a faint inscription read, "For Naomi, who shall find her way through the valley of the shadow." Dated December of 1956. Attempts to return it to Naomi Sloane's family failed. The book remains stored in a county evidence room, forgotten. And so the story of Redbird Creek endures as a partially reconstructed mystery, a reminder that the darkest horrors often arise not from supernatural forces, but from human beings, from distorted authority, from communities slowly conditioned to accept the unacceptable in the name of a higher purpose. The truth of what happened to Hiram Parsons, Louisa Madden, and Naomi Sloane, and of what truly occurred in that snowbound cabin during the winter of 1957, remains unknown and likely will forever.